Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would talk about this topic. I thought that I would talk about this conversation. We actually have a few things to talk about this week, so I will be posting more this week than I did last week. There certainly is more interesting conversations happening this week than there was last week. So, let's just get into it, man. Anyways, I'll be talking about a certain amount of things this week. I got to talk about this topic that I would kind of start off with that. I also got to talk about the Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury thing. I'm going to talk about the UFC 262 main event. It's a little bit late for that. I'm a little bit late for that, so I apologize for any of you that maybe were watching for that. But overall, I will be commenting on that because I watch UFC quite a bit as well, and I like to comment on the big fights. Also might be commenting on a couple of other things. And also, I might give a Josh Taylor versus Jose Ramirez final breakdown. I already released a fight prediction on that quite a while ago, so go ahead and check that out. I released it about a month ago, so just scroll through the videos and you might be able to find it. But I'll probably release the final breakdown anyways. Anyway, the topic that I wanted to kind of start off with or talk about is this thing that I've been hearing, and this is not the first time that I've heard about this. Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, is the number one pound for pound fighter today. But a lot of people, and I would disagree with them, but a lot of people overall would debate that either Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. is the number one pound for pound fighter in the world. And even though I don't think either Terence Crawford nor Errol Spence Jr., I don't think that either of them are above Canelo Alvarez on the pound for pound list. When it comes down to it, Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford certainly are special fighters, and they're at the 147 pound weight class. Canelo Alvarez, he now fights at the 160 to 175 range, kind of around there, but mainly in the 160 and 168 pound divisions. He mainly fights there now. And I think Canelo Alvarez has defeated a very great list of opponents. Now, of course, you have a certain amount of people that try to degrade Canelo Alvarez's competition. But when we just take a look at it in the past few years, he's fought Golovkin, he's fought Danny Jacobs, he's fought Callum Smith, he's fought Billy Joe Saunders, he's fought all those guys. And I consider all those guys A-class fighters. And Canelo Alvarez, he's beat them all. The first time against Golovkin, I thought that he lost, but in the rematch, I thought that he won the fight. So it is what it is. Either way, I think Canelo Alvarez has really prospered. I think overall that Canelo Alvarez has really transformed himself into the number one pound for pound fighter. Terence Crawford also is one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. Errol Spence Jr. is also one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. A former boxer, a former champion, a former top 10 pound for pound fighter, and most of us know who he is, Carl Frosch, when it comes down to it. He said something very interesting the other day when he was talking about Canelo Alvarez. He said the only person that might be able to defeat a Canelo Alvarez would be a Terence Bud Crawford, because Terence Bud Crawford is the closest thing that there is to a Floyd Mayweather Jr., which I find very, very interesting. So I thought I would talk about what do I think are the chances that Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez could happen in the future? What do I think the chances of Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez are in the future? And do Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. Have a chance against someone like a Canelo Alvarez, who's not only a tremendous talent and a tremendous fighter, a great fighter, but someone who is a decent amount bigger than them. So let's talk about it here and now. Anyways, man, when it comes down to it, first of all, do I agree with what Carl Frosch said? Do I believe that Terence Crawford, if there is a fighter out there, that Terence Crawford is going to have to be the one to defeat him? I understand where he's coming from when it comes down to it. What I'll say is this. When it comes to a fighter, if I were to point to a fighter today where they would remind me the most of Floyd Mayweather Jr., a current active boxer right now, I would have to say it would be Terence Crawford, at least in terms of style. Now, I don't think that Terence Crawford is as skilled as a Floyd Mayweather Jr. was. I don't think that Terence Crawford has quite the skill set that Floyd Mayweather Jr. does. But what Terence Crawford reminds me of, he kind of reminds me of a poor man's version of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. But even with that, that's still a great compliment. Some people may disagree. Maybe some of you would think that Terence even has a better skill set than Floyd Mayweather Jr., although I probably won't find many people that would say that, but, you never know. But when it comes down to the overall bottom line is this. When I take a look at it, I think that Terence Crawford is a very great fighter. He certainly is one of the better fighters that I've seen in recent years. I do believe that he is one of at least the top 4 pound-for-pound fighters in the world today. I have him either at number 3 or number 4. Maybe some of you could even debate him at number 2 when it comes down to it. A major criticism that I've had of Terence Crawford in his career, and I support Terence Crawford because Terence Crawford is one of my more favorite fighters to watch. And on top of that, he is from my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. A lot of you people may not know that. But when it comes down to it, I've always supported Terence Crawford. But I have kind of criticized his career a little bit because I don't think that he's really ever fought any official A-class fighters, which is not something that I can say about an Errol Spence Jr., who I think overall has fought repeated A-class fighters, and the same thing with Canelo Alvarez. So overall, I think both of those guys, in terms of resume, are a step ahead of a Terence Crawford. But how would Terence Crawford do against a Canelo Alvarez if he were able to face them? Do I think overall that he would actually beat a Canelo Alvarez? Do I think that he can do to Canelo Alvarez today what Floyd Mayweather Jr. was able to do to Canelo Alvarez back in late 2013? Do I think that he can do the same thing that Floyd Mayweather Jr. did? Personally, if you were just going to ask me, I don't think so. And a certain amount of people may disagree. I think that Terence Crawford is a great fighter. I think that Terence Crawford is a tremendous fighter. And one thing I'll give him a compliment on, one thing that I noticed in Terence Crawford that I don't necessarily notice all the time in a boxer, he has great adaptability. He has great instincts when it comes down to it. He usually knows what to do even when things aren't going his way. He usually makes the right adaptations. He usually makes the quick adjustments that he needs to. You notice that all the fights that he's had, problems with, all the fighters that he's had problems with, he always makes the correct adjustment and usually ends up knocking them out. Whether it be a Yuriorkis Gamboa, who gave him a lot of problems in the first half of the fight, and Aegis Velasquez, who actually was able to give him some problems in the early part of the fight, a Thomas Delorme, who gave him some problems in the early part of the fight. Terence Crawford always usually makes the right adjustments and is able to stop those type of opponents when it comes down to it. But what would he be able to do against a Canelo Alvarez? Do I personally see him ever going up to 160 and beating a Canelo Alvarez? Well, I think, first of all, for Terence Crawford to ever go up and face Canelo Alvarez, and personally, I don't think the fight's ever going to happen. Because Terence Crawford, in this interview, and you can go ahead and look at this video right here. I think this is by Fight Hub TV. The title is Terence Crawford asked if he would fight Canelo. He's a tremendous talent, but the fight would never happen. That's what Terence Crawford said, because I think even Terence Crawford realizes that Canelo Alvarez is probably too big for him. And not only that, but he realizes that Canelo Alvarez is an A-class fighter. If that fight were to ever happen, I would have to see what Terence Crawford would be able to do at 154. I think that Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, when I take a look at both of them, I think that they could be moderately successful at 154 pounds. But to be real with you, and Errol Spence has kind of proven himself at welterweight, I need to see Terence Crawford in the big fights at welterweight first. I need to really see how he would do against a Keith one-time Thurman, against an Errol Spence Jr., against a Sean Porter, against a Danny Garcia. Now, apparently Danny Garcia is moving up to 154, but when it comes down to the overall, still, maybe that's a fight that can happen a little bit later on down the line. You never know what's going to happen. And there might be, a Manny Pacquiao, but Manny Pacquiao might retire soon. Mikey Garcia would even be a good name. Terence Crawford, man, he doesn't have any of those big names on his resume. I need to first see how Terence Crawford would do against those guys. Now, would I favor him against the majority of those guys? I would, but you never know overall what could happen. Adrian Broner, once upon a time, was looked at as the second coming of Mayweather, and look what happened against him, against Maidana, and then later on against every big fighter that he ever fought. And by big fighter, I'm talking about A-class fighter. So you never know really what's going to happen. I see Terence Crawford as a different type of fighter than an Adrian Broner, but you never truly know until they face the legit A-class fighters. So I would like to see Terence Crawford in big fights sooner than later, but I don't know. We'll see what ends up happening in Terence Crawford's career. On top of that, when it comes down to it, I would also like to see Terence Crawford, if he were able to take care of the welterweight class, I would like to see him go up to 154 pounds and see what he can do there. I think that both Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. would have actually a decent chance to somewhat take over the 154-pound division. I don't see a fighter there. Maybe Jamel Charlo. Lara at one point in time, I think could have, but Lara, I think unfortunately at this point in time in his career is done. But when it comes down to, besides Jermell Charlo at that weight class right now, I don't really see another fighter that would probably be able to compete with an Errol Spence Jr. or Terence Crawford in terms of skill set. I don't know, maybe J-Rock Williams, maybe he could do something if he doesn't get knocked out, because J-Rock Williams doesn't necessarily have an A-grade chin, and sometimes he doesn't always come in as focused as he needs to be, and then he gets hit by certain punches that he shouldn't, and then he ends up getting hurt or knocked out, and and sometimes the fight ends up closer than it should. So I don't know. I think Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., I think they have a decent chance in 154. But then when you go up to 160, that's a different division when it comes down to that's it's kind of a different size comparison when it comes down to, because let's say Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. were to move up to 160. You got fighters like Jermall Charlo there. You got fighters like Demetrius Andre there. You got fighters like Gennady Golovkin there. Now, Gennady Golovkin, let's say Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. were to go up to 160. Gennady Golovkin's probably going to be retired by that time, but maybe Demetrius Andre and Jermall Charlo could still loom around there. Maybe a Billy Joe Saunders could still be there if he recovers decently well. I'm not necessarily sure. Danny Jacobs, who knows? But when it comes down to the overall, I think going up to 160 for both Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., I would say that it's more possible for an Errol Spence Jr. when I take a look at the size of them, and also when I take a look at the power. It's not that Terence Crawford does not have decent power. He looks to have decent power, but I think that his power is about a level below Errol Spence Jr.'s. I think that Terence Crawford, he seems to have around the same amount of power as a Sean Porter. Now, some people are going to come at me and say, well, did you see his last fight against Kell Brook? I did see his last fight against Kell Brook, and that showed me that Terence Crawford still has decent power, that he was able to knock out Kell Brook within about 4 rounds, I believe. But that was kind of a Kell Brook that was washed up. And a certain amount of people, they may not like that, but Kell Brook really was not at the same point in his career that he used to be. So it is what it is. But when I take a look at it, I think that Errol Spence would probably have more of a chance than Terence Crawford to do better in the upper weight division, because Errol Spence, he seems to have a little bit more size compared to him than what a Terence Crawford does. And on top of that, I believe that he can take a little bit more damage than Terence Crawford. He also seems to have a little bit more power. So moving up the weight divisions, if Terence Crawford can completely outbox these guys, if he can, still transfer his power and his speed, which he probably would be able to a little bit, but it's going to be riskier for Terence Crawford in these weight divisions, because once again, he cannot, I'm not saying that he has a weak chin. I'm not trying to get that across, but I have seen him hurt in a multitude of fights. I'm not sure if he would have as great a punch resistance in those weight classes. On top of that, I just think he's a little bit too small. I think Terence Crawford realizes that he's a little bit too small. So personally, if you were just to ask me the question, do I believe that Terence Crawford will beat Canelo Alvarez? No. I think that Canelo Alvarez, to be honest with you, if I had to guess, I think more than likely Canelo Alvarez would probably stop him. I think that he would dominate Terence Crawford. Now, if they were similar in size and they were naturally the same weight class, I may even favor Terence Crawford with his skill set. And here's also the thing, because some people are going to bring up Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andre. Well, how much of a chance do you give them against Canelo Alvarez? Well, here's the thing. I don't really see anyone in those weight classes at 160 or 168. I don't really see any of those guys having the same skill set as a Terence Crawford or an Errol Spence Jr. I don't see any of those fighters. Any of those fighters today, I don't even see them having the same skill set as an Andre Ward when it comes down to it. So I'm not saying that they're not talented divisions, because they're very talented divisions, but there's no fighter out there right now within those 160, 168 pound divisions that I would say, wow, they have a great chance of defeating Canelo Alvarez. Not one. Caleb Plant, who I think might have the best chance of defeating Canelo Alvarez out of all those guys. Demetrius Andre, who might have the second best chance. Some would argue the best chance. It depends on your perspective. Personally, I give them about a 30% chance against Canelo Alvarez. I don't see them beating Canelo Alvarez when it comes down to it. That's just the way that I see it. Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez, a lot of people want Canelo to face one of them, but I believe that those guys are actually tailor-made for Canelo Alvarez. I don't think that those are very good styles for Canelo Alvarez, because I think Canelo Alvarez is, I think that that's the perfect type of style for Canelo Alvarez to completely outperform. That's just personally my opinion. But it is what it is. We'll get to that if those fights get set up a little bit later on. But when it comes down to it, once again, Terence Crawford, how would he do at 154? I would be interested. I think that he could possibly do decent at 154. 160 seems to be, that's when it's like, okay, might be a little bit too big for him. Now, Errol Spence Jr., to talk about him real quick, do I believe one day that a Canelo versus Errol Spence Jr. fight could happen? I believe that it can happen when it comes down to it. I believe that, an Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez fight can happen. I don't think that that's out of the realms of possibility. But do I see Errol Spence personally beating a Canelo Alvarez? I mean, let me say this, because the Terence Crawford fans and the Errol Spence fans, they always kind of go at each other a little bit as well. And there's always debate about who's the better fighter and all sort of stuff. I've heard certain Terence Crawford fans call Errol Spence Jr. one-dimensional, which is interesting. I've never seen Errol Spence Jr. as a one-dimensional fighter. He can box actually decently on the back foot. He can box well in a dog fight. He can box well going forward. Errol Spence Jr. is all around very good boxer. I think both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford, for boxers today, I think that they're both A+ skilled, at least in the A range when it comes down to it, if not A+ when it comes down to, depending on what you would rank as A+. But when it comes down to the overall, bottom line is this. I think that both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford are A+ fighters. I think that Errol Spence would have an easier time moving up in the weight divisions when it comes down to it, because he has more power than Terence Crawford. He seems to have more punch resistance, and he seems to be naturally a little bit bigger. But when it comes down to it, who knows? Now, once again, do I see either of these guys defeating a Canelo Alvarez? No, I think Canelo Alvarez is... The thing is that Canelo, to me, when I take a look at him, he's on that Terence Crawford, on that Errol Spence Jr. level. When we talk about skill set, when we talk about, I'm trying to think what else. When we talk about skill set, when we talk about talent, I think that Canelo Alvarez is on that same level as a Terence Crawford, on that same level as an Errol Spence Jr., and he's just naturally bigger than them. And when you have two people that are on the same talent level, two A+ fighters, and the one man is bigger pretty much in every category, the bigger man is usually going to win that fight. Now, some people are going to point to the Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo Alvarez fight and say, well, overall, those were two A-class fighters, and overall Mayweather was able to dominate him. Yeah, but Mayweather, when it comes down to it, Mayweather's a different type of fighter. I think Mayweather isn't just an A+ fighter. I think Mayweather is an A+++ fighter, is what I think Mayweather is. Mayweather is one of the all-time greats. Mayweather isn't just a great fighter. Mayweather is an all-time great fighter. He's one of the 10 greatest fighters, in my opinion, in boxing history. Probably top 5 when it comes down to it. So Mayweather, to me, is just on a different level. And when I take a look at Floyd, to me had less faults than both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford. And I think Floyd Mayweather, you can argue, was a greater athlete also than both Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., even though both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford are both great athletes. So, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. But if you were to ask me, do I believe that Terence Crawford is the one to defeat Canelo Alvarez? I understand where Carl Frost is coming from. But personally, I just don't see it. I don't see Terence Crawford moving up. And Errol Spence Jr. could have a shot. Who knows? But I think that Canelo Alvarez is a little bit too big for the both of them at the end of the day. But we'll see what happens. I would not be surprised, especially if Errol Spence Jr. was able to move up and be somewhat successful. Terence Crawford, he's a little bit lighter, it seems like. So I don't know if he'll be as successful climbing up those weight divisions. But who knows? We'll have to see. As for a Terence Crawford-Errol Spence fight, that's a 50-50 fight. And by the way, I'm making it sound, some people, may believe that I'm making it sound that Errol Spence is a greater fighter. I don't think that's, in terms of skill set, I'm not going to say that Errol Spence is, 100% better than Terence Crawford. I think even when it comes to skill set, you can debate that Terence Crawford is better than Errol Spence Jr., but that doesn't mean that one is not going to be more successful while moving up, the weight classes. And I think Errol Spence just has a little bit more size to him. So it is what it is. But anyways, we'll see what happens. You never know what's going to happen in the sport of boxing. Personally, I don't think Terence Crawford is ever going to fight Canelo Alvarez because I think he knows that that's a little bit out of his reach. And I think he would be correct on staying with that because Canelo Alvarez, he's a big guy. He's a big guy, man. He rehydrates at about 185, 190 when it comes down to it. Terence Crawford is about 160. I mean, Canelo would literally be about 25 to 30 pounds heavier than a Terence Crawford. Errol Spence Jr. rehydrates around 160, but he could possibly, I think, move up more into the weight than a Terence Crawford. So we'll have to see what happens. But when it comes down to the overall, that's pretty much this topic for today. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think Terence Crawford actually does have a chance of defeating Canelo Alvarez one day? Do you think that he would do good at 154 and 160? Let me know what you think on that. Also, what do you think about Errol Spence Jr.? Do you think that Errol Spence Jr. would have a good time at 154 and 160? Do you think that maybe he one day has a possibility of defeating Canelo Alvarez? Let me know what you guys think on that. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.